We think of Vikings as fearless raiders and ruthless warriors, but the battlefield was only the beginning. The real terror began after the shield walls broke, after the swords were sheathed, when the defeated lay lifeless in the mud. For the men, death was swift, but for their wives, their daughters, and every woman who survived the raid, the nightmare was only just beginning. What awaited them wasn't just cruelty, it was a system so brutal, so calculated, that death itself often seemed merciful. You might think you understand Viking savagery, the raids, the pillaging, the burning monasteries, but the sagas themselves barely dare to whisper what came next. Behind the mythology of adventure and conquest lies a machinery of human suffering, rituals, laws, and practices that turned women into property, sacrifices, and commodities. And the evidence is undeniable, written not only in chronicles, but carved into runes, preserved in bones, and buried beneath the soil of Europe's oldest cities. If you're passionate about documented Viking and Norse history, make sure you subscribe. It helps us keep uncovering these stories, grounded in eyewitness accounts, law codes, and archaeological discoveries. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We always enjoy seeing the global community learning history together. Now, back to the story. In 841, the monastery of Clonmacnoise fell to Thorgils and his fleet. 43 monks were cut down defending the altar. The chronicles fall silent about the women, but the ground does not. Excavations in Dublin's Wood Quay revealed slave markets, chains fitted for women's wrists, ankle rings small enough for children, and storage houses built for human cargo. The Norse plundered not only gold and silver, they plundered bodies. In the Dublin markets, a young wife was valued like livestock. The going price was coldly set: 20 silver for a girl in her prime, 15 for a mother, 10 if she was wounded in capture. These weren't guesses. They're carved into stone, runic inscriptions from Schleswig, receipts in rock, the Vikings' own accounting of human trade. Yet for many women, being sold into slavery was the least terrible fate. In 862, Norse raiders stormed Portmaro. The Irish annals record 47 warriors killed, but the women taken alive vanish from the record. Soil samples from nearby bogs tell the missing story. Archaeologists uncovered 23 female skeletons, each marked by deliberate violence. None were random casualties. The wounds followed patterns: skulls fractured from behind, forearms shattered from defense, ribs broken by prolonged assault. These were executions carried out days after the raid. Systematic, intentional, ritualized. The pattern repeats again and again. In 871, the great heathen army captured Reading. Chroniclers note the defeat of King Ethelwulf, but omit the women's fate. Excavations at the Saxon palace reveal bloodstains embedded in stone, residues of iron oxide, enough to testify to dozens of deaths. The evidence doesn't lie. The royal women weren't spared. Viking law itself codified the cruelty. A slain warrior's wife became the lawful property of his killer, not as a servant, but as a forced wife, what the Old Norse called a kona, literally owned woman. Icelandic law codes spell out the ritual. Within 3 days of capture, the victor had to declare ownership before witnesses. Consent was irrelevant, resistance was irrelevant. Once claimed, the woman's new status was legal. Any children born of that forced union were considered legitimate heirs. Assault wasn't just tolerated, it was embedded into the legal framework of Viking society. By 878, the monastery at Bangor fell to Norse raiders. The Irish annals record the destruction of its buildings, the slaughter of its monks, but remain silent about what was inflicted upon the women captured there. The ground, however, speaks more clearly. Burn layers and bone fragments reveal female remains arranged in deliberate patterns, grim evidence of ritual. The Norse believed that when a warrior died, his possessions, his animals, even his women, should follow him into the afterlife. Archaeology confirms this wasn't symbolic poetry, but a brutal reality. Across Scandinavia, boat burials have uncovered female skeletons bearing strangulation marks, crushed windpipes, and even traces of henbane, a hallucinogenic drug, within their teeth. The victims were subdued, dazed, compliant, then slain to accompany their masters into death. The Arab traveller Ahmad ibn Fadlan recorded one such scene on the Volga River in 921. He described the funeral of a Norse chieftain, horses slaughtered, weapons laid beside the corpse, and a slave girl chosen for sacrifice. Over several days, she was forced into ritual drinking, raped by multiple men as part of the ceremony, and finally strangled and stabbed before being laid at her master's side. Fadlan's account was so vivid, so horrifying, that even centuries later, historians questioned whether he had exaggerated. Yet the skeletal evidence in burial mounds across Scandinavia shows he told the truth. This was not isolated cruelty, but a cultural norm codified in practice. Women weren't only spoils of war. They were currency in life, property in law, and offerings in death. And for concubines, their fate could be far worse than slavery. To die with a master was considered an honor, but it was a choice only men could make. For the women, there was no choice at all. By the winter of 907, the great army had set up camp at Thetford. Chronicles describe cattle stolen, churches burned, but say nothing about what happened inside the camp itself. Archaeology fills the silence. Excavations of rubbish heaps unearthed infant bones. Dozens of them, each bearing blunt force trauma. These weren't stillbirths or natural deaths. They were murders. Viking law made the reasoning clear. If a woman was a slave, then so was her child. And if that child was too young to work, it was considered worthless. Killing infants wasn't chaos. It was economics. Brutal efficiency governed Viking society, even in the most intimate corners of life. The Domesday Book, compiled centuries later under Norman rule, records the chilling continuation of this practice. Infants born to enslaved women were not listed as heirs, but as expendable property, often disappearing entirely from household tallies. Population studies in former Norse regions of England reveal gaps that align precisely with this systemic elimination. At Repton, where the Great Army wintered in 873 to 874, excavations uncovered 249 skeletons. Only 63 were female. The imbalance was stark. Women didn't vanish naturally. They were carried off, traded, or destroyed. Isotope analysis revealed many of the women weren't local. They came from Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, confirming the Viking economy of human trafficking. Those buried at Repton were the fortunate ones, dead from disease or childbirth. The rest were absorbed into slave markets that stretched from Dublin to Baghdad. For the women who survived, their status was reduced to breeding stock. Slave markets in Dublin sorted women by age. The young sent to Norse farms for forced reproduction, the older shipped east along the river routes into Islamic markets. Archaeology at Dublin's waterfront shows decades of expansion between 841 and 970. Dendrochronology, the science of tree rings, proves continuous rebuilding of docks and warehouses, not for trade in furs or fish, but for storage of human cargo. The eastern slave routes were the arteries of Viking power. From Dublin, ships carried captives to Norway, then eastward through Novgorod and Kiev, down the Dnieper River toward the markets of Constantinople and Baghdad. Rune-carved manifests recovered from shipwrecks list slaves alongside amber and furs, human beings recorded as inventory. The numbers are chilling. 20 women per ship, the standard cargo. Arab chroniclers describe these caravans with a mixture of horror and fascination. To the wealthy elites of Baghdad, pale-skinned women from Germanic and Celtic lands were luxuries, displayed like exotic goods. Viking traders understood their buyers and supplied them with ruthless efficiency. A captured wife or daughter wasn't just plunder. She was export material, fueling an economy that stretched across continents. Yet captivity wasn't the worst fate. For women who resisted, punishment was designed not only to kill, but to terrify. When Irish forces briefly recaptured Dublin in 914, they discovered shallow pits outside the walls. Archaeology later confirmed their use, stone-lined holes intended for slow death. Skeletons within show shattered legs, broken arms, injuries preventing escape or suicide. The pits were too deep to stand, too narrow to lie flat. Victims died crouched, parched, and broken, sometimes over days. Viking law codes confirm the practice. A slave woman who harmed or killed her master was condemned to be buried alive. But this wasn't a swift burial. The pits were left open to air, ensuring survival long enough for thirst, cold, or exhaustion to finish the job. Some were filled with water, drowning captives slowly. Others were strewn with jagged stones to tear flesh. These punishments weren't merely about justice, they were lessons. Captives were forced to watch, learning exactly what defiance would bring. For Viking society, women weren't just victims of war. They were resources to be exploited and examples to be made. By 919, Norwegian King Harald Fairhair consolidated his rule. Civil wars among the Norse ended, but their slave economy did not vanish. It evolved. With peace at home, raiding turned into business. Trade routes became predictable, delivery schedules reliable. Captives weren't simply stolen anymore. They were promised. Merchants advertised delivery dates for human cargo as though they were livestock. The Byzantine Russ's Treaty of 944 preserves the details. Slave prices were standardized. Young women commanded the highest rates, pregnant women sold at a discount, and children under 10 were valued so little they were almost given away. The market had rules, categories, and calculations. Slavery wasn't just a byproduct of conquest. It was a structured industry with economic logic. The climax of Viking raiding in Ireland came in 937 at the Battle of Brunanburh. 5 kingdoms united to drive out Norse forces. The victory was decisive, but what was found in the baggage train revealed a darker truth. Portable breeding pens, iron-fitted wooden cages designed for transport, were uncovered. Each could hold a dozen adults or 20 children. Wear marks on the chains proved constant use. These weren't improvised tools of war. They were standard equipment engineered for mass movement of human cargo. The pens were part of a larger infrastructure woven into every Viking settlement. Archaeological surveys show holding cells in town centers, warehouses by the harbors, and dedicated processing areas designed for captives. Women weren't collateral damage. They were the prize. The wives and daughters of defeated warriors were harvested like resources, counted, sorted, transported, and sold. For concubines, their role was systematized in law. The Graga's law codes of Iceland laid it out with chilling precision. A man had 3 days after capture to claim a woman before witnesses. Once claimed, she became his legal wife or concubine, regardless of consent. If she resisted, the law still bound her. If she killed herself to escape, her family owed compensation, 40 silver marks, more than a free man's annual income. Even suicide was transformed into theft of property. In 954, Eric Bloodaxe fell at Stane, and with him, the last Viking kingdom in England collapsed. But defeat brought no mercy for the women left behind. Archaeology at Reptun reveals the truth the sagas refuse to tell. Beneath the soil lay a mass grave sealed in 986 to 236 bodies, all female. Each bore signs of deliberate killing, blunt force trauma, strangulation, poisoning. Isotope testing shocked historians further. These were not foreign captives. They were Norse-born women, wives, daughters, and sisters of the very men who buried them. Why kill their own? Because they knew what awaited in defeat. For generations, they themselves had inflicted unthinkable cruelties on the captured wives of others. And when the tide turned, Viking men turned those cruelties inward. The killings weren't panicked massacres. Soil cores show the deaths stretched over days, even weeks. This was organized extermination, methodical and controlled. Families destroyed their own to deny them to the enemy. Husbands executed wives. Fathers ended the lives of daughters. One discovery makes the horror unforgettable. Among the skulls was a girl no older than 14. Carved into her bone was a runic inscription, "I'm better this way." The carving was done after death, as though someone needed to justify the killing. It wasn't rage. It was rationalized annihilation, a mirror of the very logic they had used against others. Repton wasn't alone. Across former Viking settlements, mass graves of women date precisely to years of Norse defeat. Silent testimonies to a final grim calculation. If they could not own their women, they would erase them. The sagas are silent. The chronicles look away, but the bones preserve the truth. Viking cruelty didn't end at conquest. It followed them into collapse. With Eric Blood Axe's fall, Viking rule in England ended, but the machinery they built didn't disappear. It was absorbed. Christian rulers inherited their slave networks, renamed them, and carried on. Monastery records from the late 10th century describe the sudden rise of indentured servants, a sanitized term for the same captives who once filled Viking pens. Nothing had changed except the language. By 1066, the Norman conquest brought a new wave of domination. William's knights received not only land, but chattels, lists that tallied livestock, grain, and women in the same breath. The Domesday Book records these entries plainly. Saxon widows and daughters were counted as property to be redistributed. Women who had once endured Viking concubinage now faced it again, legitimized under the guise of Christian marriage. Marriage became the legal mask for conquest. Forced unions transferred not only bodies, but property. A Saxon heiress wasn't a wife of choice. She was a vessel through which Norman lords absorbed land. Chroniclers of the time called it civilizing Saxon blood. Modern eyes recognize it as ethnic cleansing by sexual violence. Archaeology shows the system's brutality. Norman castles often included holding cells, built specifically for women, stone chambers with iron doors, some capable of containing 30 captives. Refuge heaps outside reveal the cost. Infant bones, almost none surviving beyond infancy. These weren't accidents of neglect. They were deliberate eliminations, clearing liabilities from forced unions. The church both resisted and enabled. Records show a surge in convent populations immediately after the conquest, as women fled to religious life to escape forced marriage. Noble women's suicides soared, canonized as martyrs in some accounts, dismissed as property losses in others. Baptismal rolls list hundreds of foundlings of unknown parentage, children born in captivity, erased from records, sold as servants. The cycle of domination continued, now cloaked in the authority of the cross. The legacy of Viking concubinage isn't only written in chronicles, it's etched into human DNA. Modern genetic studies reveal striking patterns. In Iceland, around 60% of female ancestry traces back to Celtic women taken as captives during Viking raids. In Norway, roughly 40% descends from women of the British Isles. These weren't voluntary migrations or cultural exchanges. They were the genetic scars of generations of forced unions, repeated on an industrial scale. Archaeology makes the picture even starker. In York, once the Viking stronghold of Jorvik, excavations uncovered a building dated to around 876. Inside were 64 individual cells, each with chains bolted into stone walls. Soil analysis revealed occupation for 40 years. This wasn't a prison. It was a breeding facility. The bones inside told the rest. Hundreds of female remains, each showing signs of repeated pregnancies. Many were discarded when no longer able to bear children. These weren't hidden atrocities. They stood in the very center of York, in full view of the settlement. Everyone knew. Church records corroborate the horror. Baptismal rolls from York Minster list 732 births linked to the site. Only 12 children survived beyond the age of 5. The rest vanished from the records, described as foundlings of unknown parentage and sold into servitude. The profits didn't vanish into shadow markets. They went directly into church coffers. Medieval account books list regular payments to the operators of the facility. Not bribes, not hush money, contracted fees. The church wasn't just complicit, it was a partner. This pattern wasn't unique to York. Every major Norse settlement shows signs of similar infrastructure. Holding pens, processing sites, breeding cells, all normalized, all integrated into daily life. The suffering wasn't a hidden crime. It was an open system, visible to all, sustained for profit. At Repton, the horrors ran deeper than one mass grave. Recent soil core analysis revealed that the site wasn't the product of a single massacre, but of multiple episodes spanning half a century. Layer upon layer of female burials testified to repeated purges. This wasn't desperate violence in moments of panic. It was policy. The women buried there weren't strangers. Many were Norse-born, executed not as enemies, but as liabilities. These were women who had lived inside the machinery of Viking captivity, who had seen too much, who carried knowledge that could threaten the system if passed on. Their erasure was deliberate. Bone analysis revealed something more insidious. Traces of mercury compounds were discovered in their teeth and hair. This wasn't accidental exposure. It was poisoning, administered slowly over time. The effect was madness, hallucinations, tremors, erratic behavior. A mad woman's testimony carried no weight. By driving women into insanity before death, their voices were erased forever, both in life and in memory. Among the burials, archaeologists uncovered mother-child graves, entire families executed together. This was more than cruelty. It was containment. No witnesses left behind. No survivors to speak of the breeding cells, the punishment pits, the slave markets. And in the silence, the justifications remained. Another skull bore a carved inscription, 3 words in Old Norse, "Better this way." The same phrase found earlier on the bones of a girl at Repton. 2 separate burials, decades apart, echoing the same rationalization. It wasn't rage. It was belief. They convinced themselves that annihilation was mercy, that destruction was protection. But the soil tells the truth. This was not mercy. It was systematic extermination, a methodical erasure of women's lives, voices, and legacies, layer by layer, generation by generation. The collapse of Viking kingdoms didn't end their practices. It exported them. Across Europe, their methods of enslavement, forced concubinage, and systematic erasure of women were absorbed into new powers. Norman chronicles from the 11th century describe the custom openly. When William's knights received English estates, the chattels listed in land grants didn't stop at livestock and grain. Women were tallied alongside oxen and plows. The church sanctified it through marriage. What had been rape under Norse law became legitimacy under Christian law. A forced union turned conquest into inheritance. Women became vehicles through which property and bloodlines were absorbed into Norman control. Consent was irrelevant. A Saxon heiress could find herself married off within days of her family's defeat. Her lands transferred to her new master without a voice raised in protest. Medieval contracts expose the cold logic. Brides were priced not by beauty or alliances, but by acreage. Saxon women with ancestral estates fetched the highest value, their bodies functioning as the legal key to land. Chroniclers praised the civilizing of Saxon bloodlines, but the reality was ethnic cleansing through reproductive violence. Resistance did exist. Some women fled into convents, swelling the numbers of nuns across England in the decade after Hastings. Others chose death, their suicides recorded in church canon as martyrdom. But for most, the system was inescapable. Infant mortality rates among the forced unions approached 100%. Bones from castle refuse heaps confirmed deliberate infanticide, ensuring unwanted children never survived. The continuity is undeniable. From Norse raiders to Norman knights, the treatment of women as resources, breeding stock, political tools, expendable property, was not an aberration of war. It became a structure of rule, inherited, adapted, and legitimized under new banners. The scars of Viking concubinage didn't vanish with their decline. They spread, embedding themselves in Europe's bloodlines and economies for centuries. Modern population genetics confirms what the chronicles omit. Across Scandinavia, female mitochondrial DNA traces overwhelmingly to Celtic and Saxon women. These weren't cultural exchanges or migrations. They were the echoes of thousands of abductions, forced pregnancies, and erased identities. Every percentage point in these studies represents lives uprooted, women taken, generations reshaped through violence. The networks the Vikings built endured as well. Slave markets established in Dublin, York, and Novgorod continued to function under new rulers. When Viking dominance waned, Christian kings and Norman lords stepped in, not to dismantle the system, but to profit from it. Taxes were levied on slave sales, church records documented baptisms of enslaved children, and port authorities collected customs duties on human cargo. What the Vikings pioneered was too lucrative to abandon. Archaeology makes the scale undeniable. Excavations across York reveal infrastructure built not for trade in furs or fish, but for people. Warehouses with drainage channels for human waste, holding cells built into urban centers, docks large enough to process hundreds of captives at a time. Dendrochronology confirms these weren't temporary measures, but sustained expansions over generations. Even more chilling are the discoveries of breeding facilities. At Jorvik, cells lined with chains bore the marks of repeated pregnancies, the discarded remains of women who could no longer bear children littering the soil. Baptismal records show hundreds of births linked to such sites, yet almost none of those children survived past infancy. They weren't raised, they were commodities, disposable lives erased from the record. What emerges is a picture not of sporadic brutality, but of a system where women were plundered, processed, sold, and eliminated with ruthless efficiency. A system whose traces remain in bones, soil, and even in our DNA. And yet, not all women remained silent victims. In 923, Frankish records mention a woman named Gunhild, a former Norse captive who turned the raiders' own methods against them. She knew their tactics, their fears, their weaknesses. For 7 years, she led war bands across Frankish lands, striking Viking outposts, freeing captives, and leaving no survivors among her enemies. Her raids were brutal, mirroring the cruelty she had endured. Contemporary accounts describe her methodical execution of slave traders in Rouen. 47 men castrated before being left to bleed out. Chroniclers called her monstrous. But for the women she freed, Gunhild was vengeance incarnate. After 930, she vanishes from the written record, but burn layers across Viking outposts date to that same period. Someone was hunting them, and someone knew precisely how to break them. Her story is rare, but it proves something vital. Women fought back. Even in the face of systemic violence, Resistance existed, and resistance left its own mark in the ashes of destroyed camps and freed captives. But the larger picture remains undeniable. For the Vikings, women were not collateral damage of war. They were the war's primary target. Wives, daughters, and concubines became spoils, currency, sacrifices, and stock. Their exploitation wasn't random savagery. It was a structure written into law, carved into stone, embedded into trade networks, and normalized in daily life. And its echoes persist even now, in our DNA, in our cultural memory, and in the soil that keeps yielding bones and truths the sagas never dared to tell. If you value documented history like this, make sure you subscribe. It helps us continue uncovering these stories buried under centuries of silence. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing our global community keeping history alive. Because in the end, remembering matters. For every woman erased, every concubine silenced, every captive written out of chronicles, the bones, the soil, and the truth remain.